Isaiah, the next part is kind of tough. Isaiah chapters 13 to 23. It consists of a list of nations. Who are they? What are they doing in Isaiah? Isaiah warns about Israel's alliances with pagan nations. He warns that apostasy would lead to failure, would lead to defeat by other nations around them. So this next 11 chapters of Isaiah, it's not an easy part, chapters 13 to 23. So if not for a good commentary, we will be lost. I think most pastors are lost too. When it comes to Isaiah, we think we know Isaiah when we don't. We only know bits of that, which we can apply the prophecies to our situation. But understand that Isaiah did not, while he was prophesying to the world, he was speaking to the current situation in Israel, in Judah at the same time. So Isaiah's career, long as it is, 60 years, was filled with challenges. The change in who sits in the throne, he went through a few kings. We have to understand the historical and geographical context before we can understand Isaiah, and then begin to apply it to our lives. But tough as the challenge is, the work required is so worth it. This way, we can tie Isaiah together in one complete narrative instead of the more popular notion that at least two people were responsible in writing Isaiah. Isaiah and an unknown writer, author, who wrote chapters 40 to 66. It's the same old worn-out deduction that where there is a change in style, it must be written by someone else. But Isaiah deals with situation that was current in his day at the time he writes about the future, even as the nation of Judah was facing the Assyrians. He sees a time when they will face other nations, big and small. That's what chapters 13 to 23 is about. We seem to have the mistaken notion that chapters 40 to 66, since it dealt with prophecies, it must be written by another author. But throughout the whole book, even in these earlier chapters, we see prophecies. We forget that it was God who appointed a willing Isaiah to prophethood. We forget God. We seem to always think of Isaiah as a mere man like us. Surely God Almighty knows the future and have given Isaiah these visions of a time when Babylon would reassert themselves, that they were under the thumb of the Assyrians at that time. The Assyrian Empire was the strongest at that time and had conquered Babylon. So next few chapters, 13 to 23, Isaiah sees the vision of a Neo-Babylonian empire that would reassert themselves and enslave Judah. And then Judah would be rescued by a Mede, as in chapters 44 and 45, it mentions of Cyrus, the Mede. Isaiah didn't live through the exile. It was 175 years after his time. So chapters 40 to 66 speaks of the exile. So how could Isaiah have known? And again, we forget God. How could he have come up with Cyrus, the Mede, in chapter 45 to have mentioned a Medo-Persian king called Cyrus? The question skeptics ask, even skeptic pastors ask, how would Isaiah have come up with that name Cyrus, since the event would not be for another 175 years? Surely chapters 40 to 66 was written by other people. chapters 40 to 66 is a very vital part of Isaiah. Surely there was another author. Skeptics and scoffers, whether of the church or outside the church, wants to take God out of the picture. It is not intellectually expedient to believe in God. So I'm working on the book of Isaiah using 3 commentaries and of course the Bible. And chapters 13 to 23 mention 12 places, 12 nations, prophesied about 12 places, the known world of Isaiah's time. This is our God. Our God is a God of geography and history. And the names and the nations mentioned are Babylon, Assyria again, Philistia, which is the Philistines, Moab, Syria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Babylon, Edom, Arabia, Jerusalem, Tyre. And again, we say our God is a God of geography and history, fixing his truth by time and place. Here we see so early in Isaiah's ministry, a ministry of prophecies, even as he dealt with the current situations. The 10 nations mentioned are of that region, both great and small. Great like Babylon and Assyria, small ones, we know about the Moab, the Moabite king, and the Edomites and all the rest. The 10 nations mentioned are of that region, both great and small. When this was written, the nation of Judah was facing Assyria, who had conquered Babylon. Babylon would one day come back to harass Judah again, not just to harass. We know 175 years later, they would conquer and besiege Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and send a lot of the elitist Jerusalemites to Babylon as exiles. And Babylon would one day come back to harass Judah again. From Genesis to Revelation, Babylon is the name for a godless human civilization that seeks its own pride and glory to establish itself where God ought to be. And this goes back to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. We know that. So throughout the history of the church, Babylon has been always trying. Chapter 13, verse 11 says, I will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease. So when we don't believe God, we believe in ourselves, in our own ability, which is what the pagan nations does. See, it is by my power, by my greatness that we have done these things. Assyria, not less. Proud Assyria. And throughout, God says, these are proud and arrogant pagan nations. I found an exciting chapter in verse 13, in chapter 13, verse 17. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against Babylon. The Mede, throughout history, the Medes are mentioned. And here, so early, we see the Medes being mentioned. Here Isaiah is prophesying of the day, 175 years later, of Babylon coming against Jerusalem. We remember the exile and how Cyrus the Mede of the Medo-Persian Empire would conquer Babylon. And Isaiah 45, Cyrus will allow the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. So here in chapter 13, God has already prophesied, I will stir up the Medes against Babylon. So Cyrus will allow, in Isaiah chapter 45, Cyrus will allow the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. So what is the Medo-Persian Empire? Persia is a very small place with many tribes. Cyrus would one day be the chief tribal leader and would conquer Media and form the Medo-Persian Empire. For some reason, the name Mede always comes first, and hence we have the Medo-Persian Empire, and Cyrus is referred to as Cyrus the Mede, and also later Darius the Mede. Verse 19, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited. So a little history lesson here about Isaiah. How would he have known if not for the fact that the Torah was already written down and there was a copy in the temple? This part is going to be in 2 parts, so stay tuned for the next part when I finish up Isaiah chapters 13 to 23.